did want to let everyone know that today's audiocast is being recorded. Shouldn't be a problem because all of your lines are currently muted, except for mine. But any questions that you ask will be recorded for the call and will be included on the Q&A fact sheet that we make available to everyone following the calls. You'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, and again, we'll get started in just a minute, but you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen there's a Q&A chat box. Feel free to use that to send me questions. We'll stop about halfway through and go over some of your questions. I want to make sure you can hear me. Does someone want to raise their hand or put a comment in the chat box letting me know you can hear me okay? Okay, great. Looks like you can hear me. So we are going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank you all for being on the call. Lots of familiar faces I see on the line there. This is Bailey Crone with the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. Today we are going to be talking about the solicitation for grant applications for HVRP, which just came out a few days ago. Today's call is intended for audiences that have some familiarity with the HVRP program. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time going over the structure of HVRP overall. We're really going to dig right into the structure of the application process, and spend a lot of time talking about the changes to the SGA from this year when you're comparing it to last year's grant notice. So that's going to be the majority of our focus for today. Again, this webinar is recorded and we'll be putting it up on the web, so it'll be available if you want to go back to it. This same training will be repeated next Monday. I believe that one will be at 2 o'clock. If you have any new staff members that you want them to learn a little bit more about HVRP, you have folks that are unfamiliar with how the grant process works, or unfamiliar with HVRP overall, or maybe you have partners that you want to educate on the program, I would encourage you to send them the announcement for the webinars. We'll be conducting webinar next Monday at 1 p.m., and then the following Monday, the 27th, I believe at 1 or 2 p.m., I'll have to double check and look, for new applicants or individuals who are interested in learning more about the HVRP program. So just a plug for those other trainings. If you want to hang out with me on the web for multiple hours over the next few weeks, we're here to support you. So again, today we're going to focus on the grant solicitation, and we're just going to dive right into it. And again, we will stop twice, once halfway through the presentation and then another time at the end of the presentation to go over any questions you have. I'll do my best to answer those now. Those questions will be, and the answers that we have and requests for clarification will be sent to Department of Labor, to the grant officer for additional input. All of the information that's provided here on this webinar is available through the grant notice. This is a supplemental resource for you, so be sure to look at the SGA, be sure to look at the associated documents and attachments with the SGA, as that will be your primary resource for this grant notice. But we wanted to offer you this training so that you can have some additional insight and kind of unpack the structure of the HVRP SGA. You can ask questions by submitting them in the chat box, or you'll have an opportunity to submit your questions through the post-webinar survey that's going to come to you. You can also send your questions, if it's after the call today, to hvrp@nchv.org. We are monitoring that email address closely, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we can with answers to any questions you might have. Let's take a look at our agenda for today. We're going to, as I mentioned, spend a little bit of time talking about the overall HVRP SGA and the program. Then we're going to look into the application, which is the bulk of our training today, spend a little bit of time on the application process itself, and then really dig into the changes to the SGA, both the kind of minute, smaller changes and some of the more significant big changes that you need to be aware of, especially if your organization has applied for HVRP funds in the past year or two, the last couple of years, and you want to stay up to speed on some of those major changes. This is a good sheet for you to just print out and keep near your desk, so when you're submitting your application and you're thinking, what was that funding opportunity number or what was the CFDA number, you have it right there for you. Keep checking back at the grants.gov and the DOL Vets websites, because if there are any changes or amendments to the SGA, it is your responsibility as an applicant to be aware of those changes. We will try to make you aware of those by sending out a notification, but please do know that it is your responsibility as an applicant to be aware of any possible changes or amendments to the SGA. And I'll let you know that we have already submitted a couple of questions of clarification for DOL Vets, and I will outline those for you as we get to them. There is going to be $4 million worth of funding available, that's coming available, that will fund approximately 19 grants. Depending on the funding request, it may be more, it may be fewer than that. Be sure to stay within these funding restrictions. You do not want to submit an application that exceeds these funding levels. Whenever possible, I forgot to mention this in the beginning, whenever there's a change in the SGA within these slides, you'll notice that it's in purple. So if you notice that some of the text is in purple, that's because it's a change from the previous year's SGA. You'll see that applicants are still encouraged to serve Native American tribal lands. You do not have to necessarily apply as a non-urban program as in the previous year, but you are strongly encouraged to apply. If you're not sure which category you would fall into, take a look at Appendix E available on the DOL Vets website and through grants.gov. That will give you the overview of the 75 largest metropolitan statistical areas. From the 2010 census, that will show you which cities are urban. Anything that's not on that list of 75 would be classified as non-urban per this SGA and funding notice. We'll talk a little bit more about the award process at the end, but know that even though there are 2 award categories, the DOL Vets will base the grant awards on the strength of the application, so we won't know the distribution between urban and non-urban awards until those awards are made. You'll see the performance period is for 12 months. That hasn't changed. That will start July 1st. It is anticipated that once applications come in, that the grant review process will be completed and awards will go out so that programs can start on July 1. As always, you are expected to begin program activities on July 1st of this year, so you want to make sure that you do have your staff in place and ready to go, or you could clearly outline how you'll be bringing those people on very quickly to get that grant up and running. As always, this is a 1-year grant. Something that's different this year is there's no specific number for the amount of option years that might be available. All the SGA says in reference to that is option year funding is dependent on funding availability and satisfactory performance. So do know that going into it, that if there's funding available, there may be option years for the grant, but this is different from previous years. On slide 9, you just see some important information. I will note for you that DOL Vets has a new website. It's much easier to use. It's very user-friendly. You'll see a couple of screenshots right here of where the SGA is. You could go right to that DOL Vets website to get some more information on the HVRP SGA and just check out their website overall. There's a lot of great resources on it. The programs on the line have some experience with HVRP. I'm looking at the list, and I know all of you have worked with HVRP in the past. So these are questions you've asked yourself on a daily basis, even if you're not thinking about it, because it's just part and parcel of the work that you do. So it's a good list to keep with you. It might be a useful checklist as you're going through your technical narrative to see, have I covered all of these topics? Because HVRP core services, you really need to focus on every one of these pieces that are listed in that Can You category. This SGA aims to achieve these 5 goals, so give some background information on HVRP, identifying some of the critical elements in order to be responsive, and we'll spend some time talking about what's required and what's requested. It also gives the application process and how you could go about applying for funds and what that selection process will look like. And there's more detail. One of the themes of this SGA that we noticed here at NCHV's Technical Assistance Center is that there has been some simplification of some of the sectors and sections of the HVRP SGA. A couple new pieces to note for you on the formatting side. Be sure you're using Times New Roman font, size 12. That's a departure previously that was not specified which font you had to use, just had to be size 12. Be sure you're using Times New Roman. And you need to have 1-inch margins on all 4 sides of all of your documents. I know for some documents that was challenging in the past, but good news, you're no longer required to include a map of your service area. That's no longer in the SGA, and I know that was a document that in previous years had been challenging for those 1-inch margins. You also have some more flexibility in the documents you can use if you're submitting through grants.gov. Right here on slide 12, you'll see all of the acceptable formats that you can use. Be sure you double, triple, quadruple check all of your documents to make sure they are openable. Because if the Department of Labor grant reviewers try to open one of your documents and it won't open, unfortunately they will not be able to grade that, and if it's a must-have document, your application may be non-responsive. So be sure to check those and use a form that you're most comfortable with. I mentioned earlier that there's been some clarification on some pieces within the SGA. One of the pieces that's a little clearer in this year is what happens if you submit multiple applications, and can you submit multiple applications? The SGA says very clearly that if you as an agency have HVRP funds and you are eligible for that option year funding for 2015, you should not submit a new application if you're proposing to serve the same geographic area and the same population. So do know that if you have a current HVRP and that applies to you, you would need to wait until the next year. Now, it's a different situation if you're applying to serve a different service area or a different population. If you submit both in hard copy and you submit online, then what do? You'd want to send a letter with your hard copy explaining which application they should look at. Should they use the hard copy or should they use the online version submitted through grants.gov? If you don't submit that letter or if you don't submit it with your hard copy, they will review the version that's on grants.gov. So be aware of that if you submit more than one copy. Say you submit more than one copy on grants.gov, then what do? The most recently submitted one, so your final one that you submitted, will be the one that's focused on. Unfortunately, if that application is disqualified for any reason, they won't bump to the next one that you might have saved on there. So be sure that the final one you have in there is going to be compliant so that you don't have to worry about those pieces. But that's some direction in case, it gets down to the wire and you were going to submit online, you decide to submit in hard copy, and you're not sure what to do to make sure they grade the right one. On the eligible applicants piece, this should look pretty familiar to you. There's not a whole lot of change on who is eligible. One thing I will note for you is that it is no longer required per the SGA to submit the valid IRS statement indicating your 501c3 status. Doesn't mean you shouldn't include it. You're welcome to do so, especially if you have extra pages, but it's not a requirement within the SGA. The SGA does simplify on the 501c4. It clearly says if you're a nonprofit incorporated under the IRS code section 501c4, you're not eligible to apply for funds. We often get questions for the HVRP grant if for-profit entities are eligible to apply, and they are as long as they meet the other requirements and restrictions for the grant, but for-profit entities would be able to apply for the HVRP grant. On the participant eligibility side, this has not changed too significantly from previous years. What I will note for you is that the homeless definition is more consistent with HARS. They've consolidated that a bit more, and you might want to take a look at pages 10 and 11 of the SGA just to make sure that what you're including in your application does match the definition of homelessness as it's been outlined in the SGA. And in particular, this piece here that I'm very horribly highlighting for you has been consolidated. These next couple of slides are just giving you some more information that you might need, some of the definitions and terms that are included within the SGA. These are not definitions and terms from the definitions and terms document. These are definitions that are within the SGA. An important one for you if you're planning on subcontracting out or subawarding some of the work to other partners in your community is the difference between contract and subaward. So be aware of those definitions and which of your partners would fall into which categories as you're putting together those service contracts. That's a little bit of the overview. Now let's take a look at the actual application itself. Slide, going back. All right. If you're looking at slide 20 right now, so the components of the application is a little bit different from previous years. This year there are 4 parts of your application. Last year there were 3. This year there are 4 parts. You'll see that in a nutshell, the budget component has been broken out into 2 pieces, but there are a couple other nuanced changes that I want to point out to you. Remember that you want your budget numbers to be consistent, so your SF424, your 424A, and any other time you're talking about your budget, be sure that those numbers are all of the same. Go back and double and triple check it. Even if you are talking about leverage funds, which we'll get into in a minute, you do want to make sure that on those key documents that your budget numbers are the same. A quick note on your first part. Your first part of your application is just your SS424. In previous years, you might have submitted your SS424B. You do not need to include that this time, so just be aware that you do need to have your SF424 completely filled out. Make sure that you use the correct CFDA number right here, 17.805. Also know, this is something that's a holdover from last year, if you have sub-grantees, they do need to have a DUNS number, and they do need to supply that to you for your application. So be aware of that if you are working with any sub-grantees that they have to have and give you a DUNS number. You also need to be registered with SAM, and many of you, because you're previous HVRP grantees and you have some experience with the program, are likely already registered with SAM. In order to be an eligible applicant and also to receive funds, you need to maintain that registration with SAM. So make sure someone within your agency is going through and making sure that information is updated and current every year. And it's on a 12-month cycle. The second part of your application is your project budget. So again, make sure those numbers are consistent. There are 2 major components of your project budget. That would be your SF424A, which is your budget information form. That's a standardized form that you can find up with the associated documents for the SGA. And then your budget narrative. Your budget narrative has a little bit more detail than it's had in the past, and this is an itemized, detailed breakout of what's in your SF424. There are some pieces that I want you to take note of because they are a little bit different and require you to give more detail than you might have in the past. On your personnel costs, you want to be sure to outline all of your benefits. Previously, you had to do so for, for your fringe benefits. You want to outline all of your benefits costs. Previously, you only had to do that if it was over 35%, but be sure that you're doing that now. On your personnel piece, there are a couple different items that you need to add in your budget narrative that you might not have had there before. Your personnel section should have 4 parts. You want to put each person's individual annual salary, the percentage of that position that's going to be devoted to the grant, how much of their salary is going to be funded by the grant, and then your total personnel cost for that grant period. So it's going to have those 4 pieces on your personnel section. For travel, you're going to have to outline in a little bit more detail than previous times how you are outlining your travel expenses. So that's going to include not only mileage, but the per diem and the number of anticipated both in-state and out-of-state trips that are associated with your travel. This is related to your staff, so be sure that you include that in there, especially if your program is operating across multiple states. You want to outline clearly why there might be such a significant expense in your travel category. You also want to be sure, as in previous years, that that category does not exceed 5% of your total funds. If you do need to purchase any equipment, an important piece to know is that the equipment line item is only for those items that are $5,000 or over per unit. You no longer have to have donor approval to purchase those items, but do know that it's only for items that are $5,000 or more per unit. And also, they're highly unlikely, they being DOL vets, they're highly unlikely to fund purchases of equipment for grantees that are going into their 4th year. So do know that, that you would probably, if you're applying as a first-year program, you might have a good chance of getting those purchases approved, but not if you're applying as a 4th year. Everything else would fall into the supplies category. So if you had something that cost $4,999 per unit, that would count as a supply. The SF424A is a standardized form, as I mentioned, so while it has a construction line item that's not allowed, don't put anything in there. A big 0 is perfect for that section. You don't want to have any construction funds for HVRP. There is another category. You can use the other category. It's not restricted, but you want to very clearly outline what is going into that category so that you're giving as much per unit cost detail as you can in your budget narrative. So then we get to part 3, which is your technical proposal, and that's what we'll spend the majority of our time talking about, but we're going to skip over it for the moment and come right back to it. So your 4th part is your attachments to the technical proposal. There's no direct points associated with this piece. The majority of points are with your technical proposal, and we'll go back over that. The SGA gives a little bit more clarity this time on what kind of files you can use. If you're submitting through grants.gov, you want to make sure that you follow the standardized format for naming your files. Don't make them 75 characters with a bunch of special characters. Be sure that you follow this guidance that you'll see there highlighted in purple on slide 24 for naming your files. You want to make sure that all the file names are unique. You can use an underscore to change the different file names, but given that each one of the pieces is unique, I would suggest creating a completely unique file name for each one of the files. And again, that applies for your grants.gov application, but it would also apply for the files that are named on your CD if you're submitting hard copy. I mentioned earlier that some of the documents are required and some of them are requested. The SGA very clearly outlines which documents are going to be required and which ones are requested. Just because it's requested doesn't mean you should disregard it. A lot of those are going to be very important, and some of those requested documents are going to impact your overall scoring. Some of them have no points attached, but some do impact your scoring. For example, your organizational chart and staff resumes, if you don't include that, that could impact your overall score. There's some additional information that's required within your abstract this year. This abstract requires a summary of your project, gives the scope of the project, and also outlines the proposed outcomes. And that's something that you've done before. But you want to be sure that it not only includes the applicant's name, so your organization's name, but also the project title, if you have a project title for your HVRP program. You want to give a description of your service area. That can include your congressional district. And you also want to outline how many veterans are going to be served through your HVRP program, what you anticipate as your total cost per individual, and then what your overall funding request is. That abstract is still limited to 2 pages, but be sure to include all of that information there. Your other 2 required documents are the Statement of Intent to Work Collaboratively with DOL and the contractors. I will mention to you that the SGA states that that Statement of Intent to Work Collaboratively is included both in your 50-page, 50, and also in your 15, 15 maximums. So your 15-page technical proposal maximum, the Statement of Intent to Work Collaboratively, is included in that. It also counts toward your 50-page maximum. As always, you want to include your competitive grants plan goals chart. Be sure to use the program year 2015 version that's available up on the DOL Vets website and through grants.gov. You'll see listed several documents that are requested. Those are clearly outlined for you, so I won't go over them in detail unless you have questions on them. So let's go back to the technical proposal and outline that in some detail. So I mentioned there are 4 components of your application. You have your budget narrative, your technical proposal, and then your attachments to the technical proposal. Your technical proposal starts with page 1. You're allowed to have 15 pages for your technical proposal, 50 pages, 50, for your overall application. And your technical proposal is built out of 5 sections itself. And you see this grid on slide 25. That's actually straight from the SGA. They outline very clearly in the SGA what's required within each one of these sections, as well as the points that are associated with them. And they do that at 2 different points for you. One piece I will note is if you're submitting a hard copy application and when you're naming your files, be sure that you just use these titles as the titles of your sections. Be sure that you use the correct name. So statement of need is different from last year, so just be sure that you use the titles that you see here on slide 25. So again, you have 15 pages. Please don't go over that. If you go over 15 pages, they're not going to read it. So you want to keep it right there at a 15-page maximum. Again, it needs to be in Times New Roman, single-sided pages, double-spaced with those 1-inch margins all the way around. Be sure to use those section headers. You'll see the major components here, and as I mentioned, the only one that's name change was statement of need. So if you maybe are using section headers that you had from last year, be sure that they match what's here. We're going to go over very briefly the different sections of the technical proposal, and I'm only going to highlight certain elements because I want us to spend some significant time going over the changes to the SGA. So that's a long way of saying be sure to read those sections of the SGA in detail because I'm not going to go over all of the individual details of each one of those today. We do go into more detail on each one of those pieces on the introductory SGA webinar. So if you want to walk through those in more detail, I would suggest participating in those. But again, I'm just going to go over some of the highlights on each one of these pieces. So starting off with your statement of need, this is the opportunity to describe your geographic area, comparing it to state and national level data when appropriate. Your needs section needs to outline the number of homeless veterans that are going to be served and the number of homeless veterans that are within your area. In previous years, you had to also include the number of homeless people in your area. This SGA just asked for the number of homeless veterans. You do want to give overall poverty and unemployment rates for your area. That doesn't have to be veteran-specific, but if you have veteran-specific data, that would be useful to include. In addition to talking about what the need is, so the individuals, you want to show what the actual gaps are in services. Some of you might be familiar with the challenge report, the CHALENG report put out by VA. That looks at, within every VISN, what are the highest unmet needs of male and female veterans that are coming in for VA homeless services. That's one example of a document that outlines what are the current unmet needs and the gaps in supportive services within each community. Within this needs section, you also want to outline what are those unique barriers that are faced by the veterans who could be potential participants in this HVRP. You want to use the most reliable data possible, so be sure to cite sources when you can to showcase that you are using data that's reliable. When you're thinking about your overall statement of need piece, be sure that it has those 3 sections. So you're describing your area, you're describing the need, but you're also describing the employment market. So you do want to focus on the veterans you will serve and what the need is in your community, but you also want to show that your employment market is connected to your organization in that there are job opportunities available that you can connect potential HVRP participants to. To do that, you want to showcase some detailed labor market information and any employment trends that you can find. Your American Job Center would be a great resource for many of those pieces of information. Your overall approach and strategy is a huge section of your technical proposal. It's worth 45 points, and it has the 4 dimensions that you see listed below. And again, we're just going to go over these with a cursory overview and then go into some of the changes to the SGA. One piece I will note is you no longer need to include a participant flow chart in your application as an attachment. So that's something that I know some folks had struggled to put together in the past, and you no longer need that. In your overall approach and strategy, you want to be sure that you're accomplishing the 3 goals you see listed here. So you want to showcase how your program is helping veterans who are homeless obtain relevant skills that are related to the market. You also want to show how your program connects those veterans with their skills to employers. And not only that step, you want to go one step further and show how those employers are going to help veterans improve their earnings overall, and how your program is going to help veterans improve their overall outcomes in life. So looking at the holistic view of the veteran, achieving employment and being connected to the necessary services to maintain that job readiness and maintain employment and advance in their career. One piece I'll say on the first dimension, which is outreach, worth 10 points in your application. When you're thinking through how you're going to introduce HVRP to your community and you're working on those project orientation workshops and program awareness activities, you're encouraged to think broadly in this case. So reach out to soup kitchens, reach out to your local grant and per diem program, but be more creative. Engage with schools, engage with veteran groups, engage with non-traditional partners where veterans might be coming in who would be eligible for HVRP, who maybe you haven't worked with in the past. So be sure to think broadly. It gives a list of potential partners, and it also outlines several services that you want to connect to, service agencies that you want to connect to, but don't feel restricted just by what's listed there. Additionally, in your community, you may not have all of the resources that are either listed by name or referenced in that section. Outline what else is there for you and why those pieces are missing. Don't just leave them out of your application. Talk about your community and what's available and what's missing. This section also encourages you to talk about stand down. Now, stand down is a separate funding application, and we'll do some training on the stand down funding notice later on this year, probably in a couple of months. But we do encourage you to register for stand down, to apply for stand down funding, and also to let us know so we can make sure that your stand down is registered up on the NCHB's stand down national registry. This is a great outreach tool, and you're encouraged to discuss how you utilize stand down for an outreach component in your HVRP application and the services you provide. Your assessment and intake section might look a little different than in previous years. On the assessment side, you're really focusing on 3 areas: assessing skills, understanding knowledge gaps, and assessing barriers. That will allow you to better connect veterans to services before they're placed in employment, after they're placed in employment, and throughout the entire process. You also need to outline how you're going to connect veterans to their VA benefits, whether that's through the VA directly or possibly through a veteran service organization, a VSO in the community, maybe like an American Legion or a VFW. You also want to have some process in place for determining and making sure you document the veteran's willingness to engage in services. That's always an important part of the services we provide. I know I'm preaching to the choir with that piece because it's an important part of engaging with veterans and services. Wherever possible, and it's mentioned several points throughout the SGA, you do want to include a focus on veterans who are chronically homeless, and you also want to, whenever possible, and depending on what's available in your area, talk about how you're serving female veterans who are homeless and veterans who have dependent children, so both male and female veterans who are part of a family who are seeking services through HVRP. There were significant changes in last year's SGA related to the employment and training section and this focus on being job-driven. We have put together several resources on how do you implement job-driven training within HVRP. If you have an interest in those, please let us know and we can send those over to you. But you do want to be showcasing how your HVRP services are job-driven. So how the veterans who come in your program are connected to training that offers real skills to connect them to real jobs in their community, jobs that are in demand. You want to be sure to include that list of training entities and employers that you already work closely with. Up on the top left-hand side of your screen, when you're putting together that list, you might think, well, what information do I need in there? You want to outline what the type of training is, how it relates to the in-demand jobs in your community, what the length of the training is, give an outline of the curriculum, and talk about how it's going to improve every veteran's employment prospect who goes through it. Because your HVRP program is limited to 1 year, be sure that if you're proposing connection to a training program, that it's less than 1 year. You also want to showcase how you're engaged with your American Job Centers to support placement. Maybe you work with a DBOP, maybe they're called vet reps in your community. Showcase how you are engaged with those partners in delivering employment services. You'll also want to outline how you work with veterans to develop that IEP, the individualized, there's a misspelling on there, the individualized employment plan, and show how you're using LMI labor market information to develop your outreach to employers. Again, if you're unsure how you showcase using labor market information or wondering if you already do that, we do have resources that are available that walk you through how you connect to labor market information using tools like My Next Move for veterans, and some of the interest assessments that are available completely free through Department of Labor. Your fourth dimension within this overall big piece is your follow-up services. Be sure that if you're connecting to SUI, that's state unemployment insurance, that you have an MOU that's in place with the agency to actually transfer that information. You might want to include how often that information is updated as well, so you could show that it is a useful resource if that's something that you're using. All of your funds need to be obligated by June 30th, the end of your program year, so that includes your follow-up services. So that's a huge chunk of your technical proposal. Your next piece is moving on to your quality of linkages. This section is a little bit different than it has been in previous years, and the pieces I wanted to point out to you is there's a big focus on that holistic approach to services using your community linkages. So your HVRP program doesn't need to provide everything, but you do need to make everything in-house, but you do need to make sure that the resources and referrals are there within your community so veterans are connected to what they need to be job ready. And that's the big piece, that the connection to immediate employment opportunities and in-demand job skills training is critical, but veterans need to have the resources so that they're going to be job ready and stable so they can maintain employment and move up that career ladder. A new piece within this section is that connection to legal services. That might be a little bit different depending on what your community looks like, but maybe you already work with a veteran treatment court providing assistance with child support issues, or maybe expungement of criminal records. These are some of the pieces that you would want to outline and showcase how they help remove some of the barriers to gainful employment for veterans who would be in your program. Your quality of linkages section is an opportunity to showcase your partnerships and really outline in detail what are the referral mechanisms and the processes of service delivery that you have with your partners. It's also an opportunity for you to show what your role is within your local community on the planning side. And this is where you can describe how you work with your local plans to end veteran homelessness. Maybe you're a part of your continuum of care. Maybe you're very involved in the state ICH. What your role is on actually connecting to your community and being part of the real planning efforts to end veteran homelessness, you want to outline that in your quality of linkages section to show that, yes, you're connected, and you're also taking on the role of really making sure that veteran employment is an important partner at the table in ending veteran homelessness. We all know that employment is the difference between obtaining and maintaining housing for the long term, and showcase in your quality of linkages section how what your agency does provides that service to veterans who are homeless. According to the SGA, you must register as an employment network under Ticket to Work. If you haven't done so already, we're working with partners that do some of the training on the Ticket to Work program on becoming an employment network, and we're doing that to help educate HVRP programs on what that process might look like. So that is coming down the pipeline. If you intend to participate on that, that might be something you note in your application if you are not currently an employment network. The last piece we'll talk about here, actually two more pieces. Your organizational capacity and experience section has two layers to it. You want to talk about your staff, and you also want to talk about your organization. Within your staff, you no longer have to include biographies, but you do want to show how their experience and their history, their qualifications make them a vital member of your team. Your organizational layer, you want to show how your organization can, in particular, operate under the administrative, operational, programmatic, and financial restrictions and recording requirements of this grant. You will want to show that you have financial stability through things like having a diverse funding base. And you also want to show that your organization has plans to diversify so that if you did not have HVRP funds, you would still be able to provide services. You can showcase that through your long-term relationships in the community, having long-term leases, and even having key staff that have stayed for long periods of time. On slides 35 and 36, give some information on how you showcase your past performance if you've had an HVRP grant before. Notice here that you want to include your most recent fourth quarter cumulative quarterly report. So that means you want to include the most recently completed fourth quarter report. That would be a full year of program activities. You want to include the associated TPN and a copy of the planned goals spreadsheet that connects to that exact same TPR and TPN for that period. If you have not operated an HVRP grant, and if you have other grants that you want to talk about in addition to your HVRP, you only need to include a final year-end performance report. I think last year it was 3 years, but this time it's only 1 year. On your housing strategy, as in previous years, you cannot use HVRP funds for housing. You do want to showcase your connection to HUD-VASH, but also know veterans who are already leased up with HUD-VASH are not eligible for HVRP. That hasn't changed. So be sure to showcase how you understand that process and how you intend to get veterans enrolled in HVRP while they're eligible before they're moved into permanent housing, especially in areas where there's high implementation of housing first principles. You want to show how your community not only has enough units to house the veterans who are coming into your HVRP by number, but also that you're meeting the housing needs of the veterans who come in. So that means including both affordable but also permanent supportive housing options. Take a quick minute to see if there are any questions. I saw a question from Stephen on the budget narrative and the 4 requirements in personnel. Let me pull that back up. Ooh, good questions coming in. All right, we'll do a couple of them, and then we'll hold them until the end. The question I got from Stephen is, can you go over the budget narrative and the 4 requirements for personnel again? Yes. So in the personnel section within your budget narrative, you want to give 4 pieces. So you want to include, for each individual, you want to include the annual salary. You want to include the percentage of each position that's devoted to the grant. So maybe it's 50% FTE. Maybe they're 100% paid for by the grant. You also want to then include the amount of each person's salary that's funded by the grant. So their full salary, the percentage of their time, and then the amount of their salary that's funded by the grant. Then you also want to give your total personnel cost for the whole grant period. So that would be everyone who would be charged to the grant for the personnel category. That will give a direct line item back to that SF424 budget information form. You want the overall number for your personnel cost to match what's in that SF424. Coming from Lori, I don't see the direct cost description form listed under the cost section or attachments as required. Is this form still required? That's actually a really good question, and I have that on my list of points of clarification because I also did not see it included within the SGA as a required form, so that is something that I will ask for clarification from Department of Labor on the direct cost description form and get back to you on that. From David, are 3 years of technical performance reports required for this application? Very good question. No, you need to submit. If you have operated HVRP in the past, take a look at slide 35. You just need to include your most recent fourth quarter TPR, TPN, and the copy of the plan goal spreadsheet for that year. So it's for 1 year, the most recently completed fourth quarter report, so a report from a full year. If you also have other employment and training grants within your agency, this second section would also apply to you. You want to submit a full year of financial and programmatic reports from those programs, so a cumulative final year report. Okay, so I'm going to we're getting some great questions in. I'm going to hold them for the moment until we get to the end, and then we'll get through as many of them as we can. And again, just to clarify, I will answer them to the best of my ability. What we will do after this call is I'll take all the questions that we get. We'll answer them the best we know how based on the SGA and the associated documents. Any additional points of clarification that are not covered very clearly from those materials, we will ask Department of Labor, the grant officer, Cassandra Mitchell, to clarify and provide us with some answers. That information will all be posted up on the NCHV website and made available to you and anyone who would like to access it, along with the rest of these training materials. So we make a point not to answer any questions outside of what's provided within the materials, but we will be sure to get you answers to those questions as soon as we can. Let's talk really briefly about the application process, and then let's talk about some of the changes to the SGA. As with last year, the application is due by 4 p.m. Eastern. Be sure you get it submitted by 4 p.m. Eastern. If you can, please submit it early. Last year I had far too many programs calling me at 3:55 because they didn't get it submitted and they weren't able to get it submitted, and I would like you all to get your application submitted if you intend to apply. So 4 p.m. Eastern time. You can submit it one of two ways. You could do it electronically, or you can send it in for hard copy. Electronically, you want to use grants.gov. Be sure you don't email, telegram, or fax your application in. It can only be through one of these two processes. If you decide to mail it, you do want to mail it to this address here, the address for mailing. That's listed on slide 43 for you. Please note that there is a new reference number, so if you're submitting an application you have used before or a mailing label you have used before, be sure you update the reference number so it's correct. If you're using grants.gov, just as a reminder that process can take quite a bit of time, so be sure you get registered today. Start on that process right away. Once you submit your application through grants.gov, almost immediately you'll get a confirmed receipt email. That includes a tracking number for you, so you can keep track of whether your application was validated or rejected due to errors. That process can take up to a couple of days to get that second email. Your application has to be received, and you have to get that first email, which confirms receipt. Now, you don't have to get the second email before that 4 p.m. deadline, but if, unfortunately, you submit your application, you get that first email, which confirms that it's been received, the 4 p.m. deadline comes, and then you get the second email that rejects your application due to errors. At that point, you cannot go in and resubmit because it's after the application deadline. So you do want to try to submit early if you're going through grants.gov. One more piece on if you're mailing your application, you only need one copy now. So you want to submit your original with the signed documents, and you want to make one copy-ready copy, which means that it's very easy for DOL Vets grant reviewers to make a copy of it, but you only need one. And you also need to have a CD that includes all the documents on it. All right, let's go over some of these changes to the SGA and leave a couple of minutes for your questions. And again, we probably won't have too much time for questions because we only have about 11 minutes here and there are a lot of changes to go over, but I will record all of your questions and then get back to you. We'll make that information available to you. So I'm not going to talk about all of the changes that are listed here. These are throughout the SGA as well as throughout this presentation, but I do want you to be aware of a couple of these that are important. There's some new guidance included on submitting a redacted technical proposal. If your application is approved, you receive a grant, and you get a request from Department of Labor to submit a redacted technical proposal that would be made public, you have 45 days to do that. Previously, you only had 2 weeks, so they did extend that. Now you have 45 days. There are some new resources that are available. Take a look at the SGA on page 68 for those. Those are some resources through DOL Vets that are available to you now. The websites for those are updated. You also want to take a look at the new administrative program requirements on the SGA pages 53 and 54. There are several new requirements that you should take a look at if you're writing your grant. On the eligibility side, as we discussed previously, there's no guaranteed funding for additional option years according to this SGA. It's a one-year grant, and there will be additional option years if there's funding available. Here's some information on the structure of your application, and I know that there's a lot here, but most of this we've already talked about. So you no longer have to include maps of your service area. You can if you would like and if you have the space, but you don't have to. Be sure that your proposal includes those 4 distinct parts: the SF424, the project budget, the technical proposal, and the attachments to the technical proposal. You want to be sure that you have it broken down into those 4 categories. DOL Vets gave you a checklist this time. Now, this checklist is just for you. Don't include it in your application package, but it's just another helpful resource for you to better understand what all you need to do. You can scan through that if you want to double check that you have everything included. Again, I included the guidance that's given if you submit multiple submissions. So if you submit maybe 2 copies through grants.gov or you submit a hard copy as well as a copy through grants.gov, this is the guidance that the SGA gives you on what you need to do to make sure that the right one is the one that's graded. And just a reminder that if you submit both hard copy and online and you don't include a letter with your hard copy, the grants.gov version is the one that's going to be reviewed, and that's a change from previous years, so be sure that you include that letter. An important point to note is right here on the performance goals. Please take a look at the SGA on page 63. There are historically important performance goals as outlined by DOL Vets, including your enrollments, placements, placement rate, and cost per placement. You are required to meet at least 85% of those planned goals. The SGA itself does not give the averages for those and the thresholds that you must meet. As in previous years, it just says that you must meet 85% of your planned goals, your planned cumulative quarterly goals. So be aware of that. Take a look at the SGA and also be looking at the VPL that's included in the associated documents for more guidance on how you set out your performance goals. Most of the pieces listed on 52 we've already talked about, but just again to encourage you to think broadly on your outreach section when you're describing how you're going to do your project orientation workshops. There are some non-traditional partners that you might want to reach out to or maybe that you work with in your normal course of business, and be sure to include those even if they're not specifically listed within that section. Again, you want to include the connection to any legal services. That's in addition to this HVRP SGA, and it is a very important one, so be sure to include that. On the attachment side, and I know that right now you think, oh, well, I know some are required, I know some are just requested, it's fine. But when it gets down to the wire, This is a good list to have, and this page in the SGA is really good to have so you can make sure that you have all of these forms. Be sure you have that abstract and that it includes all of the information listed here. The statement of intent to work collaboratively with DOL and the contractor, again, is included in the 15-page technical proposal limit and the 50-page overall limit. Some of the documents are not included in that limit. For example, your contracts and MOUs are not included in either the 15-page or the 50-page. But some of the documents are, so be sure to note that when you're going through and counting your overall page limit. The documents that are not required but are requested of you are listed here. Be sure that you do include those. Most of them are available. They're standardized forms. And you want to showcase that your contracts and MOUs are in place and that they're solid. As much as possible, your MOU should showcase the process of service delivery as well as the actual services themselves. So it's less a letter of support and more a clear outline of what the engagement with that partner means. I would encourage you, if at all possible, to make sure that all of your MOUs are signed by both parties. That will give your MOU additional weight if it's signed both by your organization as well as the partner in the MOU. I mentioned earlier that your organizational chart and staff resumes are very important. There's points connected to those, so be sure that you include them. Again, for any questions that you have, you want to direct those on the HVRP, SGA. You want to direct any questions that you have to the grant officer, Cassandra Mitchell. Her contact information is here. She's with DOL Vets. You can call her. You can email her. She's great about responding as soon as she can. I'm sure she gets a high volume of questions. To help, we are here offering this training and offering the website or the email address you see here so that we can answer any questions that you might have on the intricacies of the SGA. If we can clarify, we will. If we need additional clarification, we'll request it in an aggregate process where we tend to get all of our questions answered at one time. We're here to support you as you put together your application, and just as a reminder that any questions that we get, if they're through the chat box now, if you call us, if you email us, or if you submit your questions through the survey that you're going to get after this call, we include all of those questions on a Q&A fact sheet. We'll include those answers, and that'll be available up on the NCHV website as soon as we can put it together. So probably getting a start on that by early next week, so be on the lookout for that. It'll be located with the webinar presentation materials, so any of the information from these webinars, including the recordings, the presentations, and that Q&A fact sheet will all be up on the same page. All right, I'm looking at some of the questions that have come in, and we only have about 3 minutes, so we'll get to as many of them as we can. Got a question from Brad. Is there any way to include information from the current program year in addition to the information from the fourth quarter TPR and TPN from previous grant year? So what they've requested to look at past performance is that full cumulative full year of program data from your last from your previous year. That doesn't preclude you from including other information from your current program year. You can include that. You might want to give a little context, but you're not restricted from doing that. But know that when they're looking at past performance, they will be looking at that full year finished fourth quarter TPR, TPN, and associated plan goal sheet. So again, nothing is precluding you from including that information as long as you don't go over your page maximums, but know that that's required for what they're reviewing for past performance. I had a question about what they look for on the benefits breakdown. I would encourage you to take a look at that section of the SGA. It's actually pretty clearly outlined how they want the benefits breakdown, what pieces are included. It looks like you've got most of them, so your unemployment insurance, your health insurance, and those pieces. But the SGA pretty clearly outlines what they want to see on the benefits side. Okay. The question from John. we were subrecipients on a previous HVRP grant. If we're now applying on our own, should we still need to include the most recent fourth quarter report from the grant? Well, I'll give you a couple pieces for you to chew on, and it's really up to you and your organization what you would like to include. For HVRP, past performance is significant. I'm not involved in the grant review process. I don't know how many points would be connected to that. I can't give you that guidance, but past performance with HVRP, I would assume it would be an asset to your organization if you have, and to your application. If you have any of the data from that fourth quarter for that cumulative report, I think it would be useful to include, and that's just my own personal opinion on it. Now, if you don't have access to that data and you're just talking about the fact that you have previous HVRP experience, that's fine. But the more information you can give the grant reviewers, the better. I will let you know that the grant reviewers do not have access to hold on one second. Oh, okay. The grant reviewers do not have access to any of your past performance unless you submit it. So they're not going to be able to look up, to go into VOPAR or look at any of those pieces when they're reviewing your grant. So be sure you submit that information. It is up to you as an applicant to include that information. And again, as much as you have to show that you have past experience with HVRP, that's going to strengthen your application. Let's see. Will you be able to send out this slideshow to us? Yes, it should actually be available. The PowerPoint presentation will be available as a PDF up on the NCHV website right after we get off this call, actually. And then the recording of today's presentation, they take a little bit of time to load, but we'll get that up by early next week so that you can have it. Again, there will be a repeat of today's call next week. Let me double check on the time. Is that? This is happening at 2 o'clock. If you are interested in participating in the webinar for new applicants without experience with HVRP, that one is at 1 o'clock. So you are welcome to call in for both hours of HVRP training if you would like. I know we got a lot of great questions, and Michael, I'll definitely follow up with you because we got some good questions on there, some I can answer and some that I can't. But we will get those questions posted up and get answers to you as soon as we can. Thank you all for your time, for participating. I hope this information was helpful. Please take a minute to fill out the survey we're going to send you. It's really helpful to get your feedback on what you want to hear from us and on the trainings from NCHV. So I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Have a wonderful Friday. Happy writing, and talk to you soon. Thanks. Bye.